Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. It's Fran here, and I'm back with a new video, which is going to be a Game Week 9 wildcard draft, right? We've sourced these drafts from Twitter and also on Discord. The first draft is going to be from our loyal fan, Arte. I myself, by the way, I'm not wildcarding, which is why I'm deliberately looking at these draft rates, just so I can actually give my opinion. And I can understand, obviously, if people have a difference of opinion there, that's totally fine. Ultimately, you have to trust your gut in FPL, and I think that's the first code of advice that I would give. As far as Arte's draft, one thing that sticks out to me is, of course, the inclusion of Kane. I did think he was so much more interesting on a trajectory where you have him on a game week 8, and I feel like a lot of managers are still thinking about swapping their premiums. The one issue that Kane has, though, is there's no premium to swap to. So a lot of people are interested in potential paths where you keep Son, go into Salah, and then go into KDB and maybe flip-flop between these players, but you don't have that option when you go for Kane. And I feel like that draft flexibility puts you a little bit behind if you go for Kane in game week 9, because the game week 8 wildcards at least have a free transfer. So that means that in theory they're one transfer closer to a Salah if you're opting for Kane in game week 9, and that's, I suppose, the only issue that I would say is at present with the draft. Otherwise, the picks are actually very, very good, and there's a very good amount of flexibility and strength in the bench. Really like where he is an option. I can completely understand the inclusion of Raya as a keeper over Guaita, especially since we've seen some very weird benchings over Guaita in the past. Mings is also a very, very value pick if you trust in the Aston Villa defense, and they are playing very, very defensive this season, so I can understand going for that pick. The one, I suppose, exclusion, which is something that I also excluded on my draft template that I revealed before the international break, is actually bringing Trent in and actually taking Cancelo out of your team. So what we have here is two City and Arsenal players in between Haaland and Martinelli, and I still think that that's the right way to go. And I agree with you there in that pick. A lot of people are going to disagree and simply say that Cancelo is going to outscore Trent over the next 4 fixtures, but I really think that that's debatable, especially since Cancelo is a blank. However, there is a good argument to say that you should put both Trent and Cancelo in your teams, and maybe I'm a little bit more towards that camp now, and I tried to reevaluate my team on that basis, potentially going with triple City and Arsenal, just because you'd like to squeeze Martinelli in your team, I imagine. Trippier and James, fantastic options. You won't hear me say anything bad about them. I think they're great picks, and there's nothing wrong with them. And Bailey just simply fills out a gap in your team, because you are opting for a 4-3-3 structure with Martinelli mostly playing the games. I would actually consider playing someone like Martinelli over a Mings. In my opinion, I feel like the clean sheet potential actually is much less present for Mings than it is for Martinelli to actually get a goal involvement in that Tottenham North London derby. So I do feel like that's the only thing I would really change about this draft, the team selection for Game Week 9, frankly. Otherwise, I think this draft works out really well. I'd actually probably rate it a 9. The one thing that stops me from giving it a 10 is I just feel like Kane is a little bit inflexible on a game week 9 wildcard draft, and potentially he still might be the right pick to go for. He's looked very good in form, takes some of the best penalties in the world, but I do think that some of the other premiums have shown a little bit more consistency in terms of how easy it is to swap between them when the fixtures are good. And because Haaland is so good and Mitrovic are so good as well, you don't necessarily need Kane to plug in a 3 at the front team formation. So it still makes more sense for me to go for a sort of 4-4-2 dynamic if you must, or just simply go for a 4-3-3 with a cheaper forward and then just play with a premium. The next draft is going to be from Fu Manchu. It features a 3-4-3 setup. I think this is a very, very template draft. It actually has pretty much the core of a Game Week 8 wildcard draft, with the difference of Isak being Tony. And what I like about this draft, of course, is Tony, for me, does seem like he is going to be relatively fixture-proof over the run. And I feel like even though Brentford have some tough games in between, we did see them play especially well versus teams like Liverpool and Chelsea last season, even playing in a little bit more of a defensive structure. And now that they've been a little bit more attacking, I still favor Tony to actually get some decent hauls, just like Mitrovic has early in the season. Of course, Mitrovic was an astounding surprise, and I think he's delivered a lot more than as per expectations, and therefore Mitrovic and Haaland are non-negotiables in our draft. The one issue I have with this draft really is just that triple up of City and then that Arsenal pairing, which leaves us with 4 of those players with the game week 12 blank. I myself am a little bit more towards the camp where you go for 3 players at maximum. I can understand why you'd like to go for this draft. I just feel like that is going to be the Achilles heel, because you are booking transfers in the future almost. However, with players like Maddison, Zaha, Trippier, and James, I feel like they're non-negotiable. And Guaita, for me, is still a good keeper. We did talk about, of course, when we discussed Arte and how he picked Raya and also Guehi instead, that it might be more interesting to go for someone like a Raya if you have Guehi as cover. I don't really like starting with Guaita in a game versus Chelsea, even though, of course, we've seen that this Chelsea team probably still needs a little bit more work with Potter before they actually find their offensive edge. I just think that there is a little bit of a wild card aspect with Guaita, and I really can't say that that's something that I've mastered just watching Vieira and understanding how he's going to rotate his keepers at times and the specific reasons, because he doesn't really give any. And that's the only other part of the draft that I don't really like. Otherwise, I actually think this is a very, very strong draft. It's very template, and there's nothing wrong with it. We talk about the word template all the time, but there's a reason why things are template, and I can't really crucify it. There is a lack of Liverpool, and potentially that's the only change I'd make. Potentially trying to get Salah into this team as opposed to De Bruyne. I don't really know what your Money in the Bank situation is. Potentially, I think a lot of Salah drafts have to feature someone like a Solanke. So if that's the downgrade that you have to make, I can understand maybe going into someone like De Bruyne and keeping him for now, or even going into Son, who might even last you quite well up until when you'd like to pivot into someone else, maybe back into De Bruyne after the game week 12 blank. So those are the options I would have. Otherwise, I think this draft is very strong. I'd give it an 8.5. The next draft is actually going to be from Homewood Allen. I feel like this is very, very differential. What it actually has is Sterling, and it's a very counter towards the midfield meta because we don't have players like Zaha and Maddison here. And I feel like that could be a slight Achilles heel. We also have Triple City and Arsenal, which I'm not a huge fan of, just because I feel like it, once again, it is speaking to yourself to book transfers in the future, which you might not want to do. And the triple Newcastle, I feel like, is almost a week too late because we've already seen that Bournemouth game come and go. I think there are teams like Crystal Palace that have great defensive runs ahead. I understand going for someone like a Walker Peters. He does have a little bit more of an attacking edge as a player. This Southampton team as well have posted really, really good underlying defensive statistics. And I think, of course, the actual gem of this draft is sacrificing some players to actually go for a 3 with Sterling, almost a 2.5 I suppose. Sterling is someone who I feel like has some of the best underlying numbers in the league. He's also passed the eye test for me by quite an amount. I feel like he's performed well within Potter's first game, which is a very, very small sample size for Salzburg, playing that kind of left wing back Trossard role, not really playing defensively whatsoever, but really being a left inside forward, ready to cut in and actually take chances at times, also drive at defenses diagonally. And the structure that Potter is trying to play, I think, is much less of a style where the wingers are not so involved. I think in the previous structure with Tuchel, we could see that he was trying to incorporate a lot of triangles within the right wing back, the right centre mid, and the right inside forward. Sometimes that would be a kind of dual role played between Havertz and another shifting forward, but you don't have the structure here where people have to play set roles for the team. And obviously, I think Sterling was actually someone who still thrived very well in Tuchel's setup because he was actually playing almost as a forward, as opposed to one of the wingers who drifts out wide and actually doesn't get very involved like a Havertz. I think Sterling is going to do absolutely great amounts. What I don't like about this draft, of course, is just going to be, unfortunately, Foden. I feel like Foden occupies a position that either Maddison or Zaha should play. And that's not simply because Maddison or Zaha are the meta picks. It's because they have better fixtures than Foden themselves and have more guaranteed minutes. Not only that, but they are arguably the talismans for both teams. Maddison's underlying statistics doesn't necessarily show that he's the talisman, but I feel like when you're watching games in and out, and even specifically the most recent games within the Spurs game, you can see that most of the chances do come from him, and he is finding himself in very interesting pockets of space, and this Leicester team is still trying to attack a lot. Whereas with Crystal Palace, I would say potentially they are a little bit more reserved with their attack, but most of the attacks still flow primarily through Zaha. And I think that's such a marked difference from someone like Foden, who occupies quite an interesting role in the game, but as a Man City asset, probably is almost taking away from a future spot in the team, such as a KDB. And I just feel like Maddison and Zaha have just much better fixtures to capitalize on in the short term, that you'd like to benefit from them, as opposed to book a transfer out for someone like Foden, who has a blank in Game Week 12, and also a tough fixture on paper versus United. Mitrovic and Kane, we've already talked about within Arte's draft. I feel like these are still great picks to go for, and no real criticisms about going for Neco Williams. He's not exactly the player that I love, but because Patterson is injured, we do have a situation in FPL where we are desperately looking for our fourth and fifth defenders, and I can kind of understand going for that setup. I'd probably give this draft a 7 as a result, but I do really, really love that Sterling punt, and potentially that could actually obfuscate, I suppose, the disadvantages of this draft. The last draft is going to come from Daniel from Twitter, and I actually think this is a very well-rounded draft. It actually is what I was talking about when I was looking at the 4-4-2 potential with Arte's draft, where you go for both Trent and Cancelo if you're so worried about Cancelo in the short term even, because he does seem like he's playing for one of the top teams from a defensive point of view, and game to game now we're just seeing a lot of involvements from Cancelo that don't necessarily pass the underlying statistics, but clearly pass the eye test visually, that makes us really scared to actually drop him from our teams. And I can completely concur with that sentiment. The same thing that happens with De Bruyne, but with De Bruyne, at least you have the safety net of being able to pivot into players like Salah and also even Son, who's found a little bit of form. And then Zaha and Madison, I think, are non-negotiables really on most draft templates, unless you really want to stick your neck out there and go for someone like Sterling instead, which I can totally back as well. As far as James and Trippier, of course, these are probably, once again, non-negotiables, especially if you are deciding to go off of Pope. No real issues with Guaita, especially since he's gone for Begovic here. It's an interesting one here where I suppose if Pickford's injury is supposed to be delayed, I guess you could go Begovic versus Southampton. I suppose that's the gamble here. Otherwise, I can see Daniel playing for another keeper. James Justin is an interesting pick at a very unique price point as well for Leicester. Covers the Leicester defense. You're probably never going to play one of Ward or Iverson, but I can definitely understand going for Justin if you want to have some coverage of what are very, very good fixtures on paper for this Leicester team. There are other options at 4.3 and 4.4 that are still very, very good. I think, frankly, because you have coverage of Guaita, you might even want to look at a Wolves defender potentially. Though they also have really good fixtures on paper and are also performing as a top defense. So that might be one option to squeeze into if you have a little bit more money in the bank. Someone like Kilman does exist, or even Johnny, who's a little bit cheaper. If we're looking at the team, I think the only criticism I might have is really that combination of De Bruyne and Tony. And a lot of people did go for that in Game Week 8 if they were a bit more reserved and didn't prefer going for Isak, who they thought was a one Game Week punt. And it did turn out to be the case because he has been injured. And I think a lot of issues, I guess, with the Game Week 8 wildcard, if you went for De Bruyne and Isak is, I mean, frankly, you still got someone who scored a goal in Isak, so it definitely feels like a good transfer to make. Not the best, of course, with the injury situation, but at least you can capitalize on moving into Tony. Whereas I think if you're wildcarding Game Week 9 and you were going to play a 4-4-2 setup, I really would still pick Mitrovic over Tony. I know it sounds ludicrous, but I feel like the advantages that Tony and Mitrovic have are very similar. They're both penalty takers. Potentially, Mitrovic doesn't take some of the direct free kicks. That's the difference there. But I don't think that makes a huge difference between Tony and Mitrovic. And when you look at the fixtures, I still think Mitrovic really does win out on the fixtures. And that's why I think he's more worthwhile. And he's also just a little bit more efficient on a kind of cost efficiency basis. He's cheaper. You could even squeeze your way into Salah potentially. I'm not exactly sure how much money in the bank is left within this draft template, but if you can afford something like this and go for something like Mitrovic, I think that would be preferred. And the excess money in the bank could be a move towards Salah. Here in this situation, I feel like it's actually better to go Salah and Mitrovic because Salah actually has the better fixture in Game Week 9 for me, whereas Tony has the better fixture in Game Week 9 himself. So the counterparts almost measure off here. And I can understand the sentiment of some managers who have decided to really capitalize on specific fixtures. That's exactly why I went into Isak, or some people went into Isak last week, or went into Kane in the previous week. And now it doesn't seem like the right time to go to Kane because of how important specific fixtures are, especially a nice fixture like Bournemouth on paper for a team or for a player like Tony. But if you are going for Mitrovic, I do think Salah does actually offset the upside that you would get from getting Tony for one game week over Mitrovic. Otherwise, if we're looking long term, I do think because you can pivot around the midfielders so much, and you might actually want to pivot specifically around Salah and De Bruyne and Son at that price point a little bit more, as opposed to switching between Tony and Mitrovic. I do think it actually makes sense to go with someone who has a little bit more permanence, I would say, based on easier fixtures within Mitrovic, and then actually pivot around the midfield premium. This way you can also go for Salah and forego my main problem with the draft, which is going to be when you have City and Arsenal players, when you have four of them together. I think this draft is actually going to be a 9.5 for me. It's frankly, I mean, actually I'd probably give it a 9.9 to be honest. I really like this draft a lot. I think the actual template is correct. It probably doesn't have any long-term solutions that I can really see down the line, and I really like this draft. So that's it. Thank you guys so much for watching the video.